At 1:23 p.m. on August 7, 1942, Major Paul Irving Gunn stood on the tarmac at Port Moresby, watching through binoculars as Japanese Zero fighters converged on 3 B-25 Mitchell bombers returning from a shipping strike 180 miles north. 44 years old, former Navy pilot, now serving with the 5th Air Force in New Guinea as a maintenance officer and occasional combat pilot. 1 Navy Cross already earned in the Philippines evacuation. The Zeros came in fast from 2 o'clock high, then split formation. 2 climbed above the bombers. 1 dove underneath, then pulled up directly in front of the lead B-25. Head-on attack. The Mitchell had dorsal turrets, waist guns, and a tail position, but nothing that could fire forward from the bombardier's nose position. The bombardier sat in a plexiglass nose with a Norden bomb sight and maybe a .30 caliber machine gun that was almost useless against fighters. The Zero pilot knew this. Every Japanese fighter pilot in the Pacific knew this. American medium bombers were defenseless from the front, and that's exactly where the Zero attacked. Machine gun fire and 20mm cannon rounds tore through the B-25's nose section. The plexiglass shattered. The bombardier was killed instantly. Rounds penetrated the cockpit. The pilot slumped forward. The Mitchell nosed over and went straight down into the jungle 8,000 feet below. No parachutes, no survivors. The second B-25 tried to evade, but 2 Zeros bracketed it from above and below. Then a third came in head-on. Same tactic. Rake the nose, kill the bombardier, hit the pilots, destroy the aircraft. It worked again. The bomber caught fire and crashed into the Coral Sea. The third Mitchell made it back to Port Moresby with 47 holes in the fuselage and a wounded co-pilot. 14 men dead in less than 120 seconds, and Gunn had watched it all happen from the ground. If you want to see how Gunn solved this problem with scrap metal and pure defiance, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Please subscribe if you haven't already.
This wasn't the first time Gunn had watched bombers get slaughtered. 5th Air Force had been losing B-25s and B-26 Marauders at an unsustainable rate since April 1942. The problem was tactical. American medium bombers were designed for high-altitude formation bombing in Europe. They would fly at 15,000 to 20,000 feet, drop their bombs on industrial targets, and rely on fighter escorts and defensive guns to survive. That doctrine didn't work in the Pacific. Japanese targets were ships, not factories. Convoy vessels, destroyers, cargo transports moving supplies to forward bases. You couldn't hit a moving ship from 20,000 feet with dumb bombs. The Navy tried it at Midway with B-17s, and the hit rate was less than 2%. To hit ships, bombers had to come in low, very low, 200 feet above the water or less. Masthead bombing, they called it. Fly straight at the ship, release bombs at minimum altitude, and pull up hard to avoid the ship's superstructure. When the bombs hit the water, forward momentum would carry them under the hull before they detonated. Devastating when it worked. The problem was getting close enough to release. Ships had radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, light and heavy caliber weapons that could throw up walls of flak. And the Japanese always had fighter cover, Zeros flying combat air patrol above their convoys. When American bombers came in low and slow on their attack runs, Zeros would dive on them from ahead where the bombers couldn't shoot back. The defensive guns were positioned for attacks from above, below, and behind, not from the front. North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, had designed it with a glazed nose for the bombardier, beautiful plexiglass that gave excellent visibility for the Norden bomb sight, perfect for high-altitude precision bombing, completely useless in a low-level attack where enemy fighters were coming straight at you. Gunn knew this because he'd flown combat missions himself. He wasn't just a maintenance officer. He'd been a naval aviator in the 1920s and 30s, flying everything from biplanes to PBY Catalinas. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, Gunn had been working as a civilian pilot for the Philippine Airlines. His wife and children were in Manila. The Navy recalled him to active duty, and he flew evacuation missions getting civilians and wounded soldiers out ahead of the Japanese advance. He earned a Navy Cross for those flights, then transferred to the Army Air Forces when they needed experienced pilots and maintenance officers in the Southwest Pacific. By mid-1942, he was a major assigned to the 5th Air Force Service Command, responsible for keeping bombers operational in forward areas with minimal parts and support. He worked at Port Moresby, Townsville, and other bases throughout New Guinea and Australia. He flew combat missions when they needed extra pilots. He understood the problem from both sides. As a pilot, he knew what it felt like to face Japanese fighters head-on with no way to shoot back. As a maintenance officer, he knew the B-25's design limitations and structural capabilities. And he had access to damaged aircraft, spare parts, and mechanics who weren't afraid to improvise. In early September 1942, a B-25 took heavy damage during a raid on Lae. The nose section was destroyed. Structural damage to the forward fuselage. The aircraft was flyable enough to limp back to Townsville, but it needed depot-level repair. Normally, they would ship it back to the United States or write it off completely. Gunn walked around that damaged bomber for 2 hours, looking at the destroyed nose, studying the internal structure, calculating weight and balance. Then he called a meeting with his best crew chiefs and told them something that must have sounded insane. He wanted to remove the entire bombardier nose section, replace the plexiglass with metal, and install 8 .50 caliber machine guns pointing forward so the pilot could fire them. The crew chiefs looked at each other. This violated about a dozen regulations. You couldn't modify military aircraft without engineering approval from the manufacturer. You couldn't change the armament configuration without authorization from the Ordnance Department. You couldn't alter the nose structure without recalculating weight and balance and getting approval from the Army Air Force's Technical Command. Gunn said do it anyway.
Staff Sergeant Ed Angstadt was Gunn's best metal worker. He'd been a sheet metal fabricator in Pennsylvania before the war, working on automotive bodies and industrial equipment. When Gunn explained what he wanted, Angstadt said it was possible, but they'd need help. 5th Air Force Service Command had mechanics and crew chiefs, but not enough specialized metal workers for a project this complex. Gunn contacted the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Townsville. The Australians had skilled tradesmen who'd worked in civilian aviation and manufacturing before the war. They agreed to help unofficially. No paperwork, no official request through channels, just Aussie metal workers helping American mechanics build something that might save lives. The first step was removing the bombardier nose completely. They unbolted the plexiglass sections and the internal framework. What remained was an open cavity at the front of the fuselage with structural ribs and stringers exposed. Angstadt fabricated a new nose section from aluminum sheet metal, flat panels riveted to the existing structure. No curves, no aerodynamic shaping, just functional armor that would stop small arms fire and provide a solid mounting platform for the guns. The question was where to get 8 .50 caliber machine guns. The 5th Air Force didn't have extras sitting in warehouses. Every weapon was already installed on operational aircraft. Gunn found his solution in the aircraft graveyard. Wrecked P-40 Warhawks, damaged P-39 Airacobras, B-17s that had been written off. Each fighter had multiple .50 caliber guns. Each bomber had turrets with twin .50s. Gunn authorized his mechanics to strip weapons from aircraft that would never fly again. They pulled guns, ammunition feeds, charging mechanisms, electrical firing systems, everything needed to make the weapons functional. Installing 8 machine guns in the nose required precise engineering. They had to calculate the recoil force. 8 .50 calibers firing simultaneously would produce tremendous rearward thrust. Would the nose structure hold? Would the recoil slow the aircraft dangerously? Would the vibration damage the airframe? Angstadt did the calculations by hand. He estimated recoil, distributed the mounting points across multiple structural ribs, and reinforced the areas that would take the most stress. The guns were arranged in 2 clusters, 4 in the upper nose, 4 in the lower nose, staggered slightly to allow ammunition feeds to run from the fuselage back to magazines that would hold 300 rounds per gun. They welded steel mounts and bolted them to the aluminum structure. Electrical wiring ran from each gun back to a firing switch in the cockpit. The pilot would control all 8 guns with a single trigger on the control yoke. The ammunition feed system was the most complex part. .50 caliber belts had to feed smoothly from magazines through channels in the nose structure to each gun without jamming. One jam could cause a stoppage that would leave that gun inoperative. Gunn's mechanics tested and adjusted the feed systems repeatedly. They built the magazines from sheet metal, welded ammunition chutes, installed spring-loaded tensioners to keep consistent pressure on the belts. It took 3 weeks working around the clock. By late September, the modified B-25 sat in the hangar looking like something from a science fiction story. The nose was flat, armored, bristling with gun barrels. It looked aggressive. It looked wrong. It looked perfect. But nobody knew if it would actually fly. The weight distribution had changed dramatically. The bombardier and his equipment were gone. In their place sat 8 heavy machine guns and 2,400 rounds of ammunition. Gunn climbed into the cockpit on September 28th for the first test flight. He was going to fly it himself. If the aircraft was structurally unsafe, he wasn't going to risk another pilot. The engine started normally. He taxied to the runway and ran through pre-flight checks. Everything looked good on the instruments. He pushed the throttles forward and the B-25 accelerated down the runway. The takeoff roll was slightly longer than normal. The added weight in the nose changed the balance. But the aircraft lifted off smoothly at 110 miles per hour and climbed out over Townsville. Gunn flew it for 30 minutes, testing handling characteristics. Turns, climbs, descents, simulated combat maneuvers. The B-25 flew normally, maybe slightly nose-heavy, but nothing dangerous. Then came the real test. He selected an empty area over the water and armed the forward guns. He lined up on an imaginary target and pressed the firing button on the control yoke. All 8.5 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The noise was incredible even through the heavy insulation of the cockpit. The recoil shook the entire aircraft. Tracer rounds formed a cone of fire converging about 200 yards ahead. The stream of bullets was devastating. Any target in that cone would be obliterated. Gunn fired 3-second bursts. The recoil slowed the aircraft by about 15 miles per hour during each burst. Then the speed recovered when he stopped firing. The nose structure held solid. No cracks, no structural failures. The ammunition feeds worked perfectly, no jams. The electrical system handled the load. Everything functioned exactly as designed. When Gunn landed and shut down the engines, Angstad and the other mechanics surrounded the aircraft. Gunn climbed in grinning. He said it worked better than he'd hoped. Now they had to convince the generals it wasn't a waste of resources.
Major General George C. Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force. He'd taken over in August 1942 and was already making a reputation as an innovative commander who encouraged creative solutions. But even Kenney had to work within regulations and military bureaucracy. When Gunn requested a meeting to demonstrate the modified B-25, Kenney was skeptical. He'd heard rumors that maintenance officers in Townsville were cutting up aircraft without authorization. That kind of thing could get people court-martialed. Gunn brought the gunship to Port Moresby in early October and invited Kenney to see it. The general walked around the aircraft with his staff officers. Some were impressed. Others were horrified that someone had butchered a perfectly good bomber. Kenney asked the obvious questions. How much did it cost in man-hours and materials? About 400 man-hours and salvaged parts that would have been scrapped anyway. Did it affect flight performance? Slightly slower due to added weight and reduced aerodynamics, but still within acceptable parameters. Could it actually hit anything? That required a demonstration. They set up a target on the beach, an old landing craft hull that had been damaged beyond repair. Gunn climbed into the cockpit with Kenney in the co-pilot seat. He took off and flew out over the water, then turned back toward the beach at 200 feet altitude. He lined up on the target and accelerated to attack speed, 250 miles per hour. When the landing craft filled his windscreen, Gunn pressed the firing button. The .850 calibers erupted. Tracers converged on the target. Metal tore apart under the sustained fire. Gunn held the burst for 5 seconds, then pulled up and banked away. When they landed and inspected the target, it looked like a giant metal shredder had attacked it. Hundreds of holes punched through the hull. Some rounds had penetrated completely through both sides of the landing craft. Kenney was convinced. He authorized immediate production of more gunships. But there was a problem. North American Aviation, the B-25's manufacturer, had to approve any modifications before they could become official doctrine. Kenney sent photographs and technical specifications back to the United States. The reply came back 3 weeks later. North American's engineers said the modification was structurally sound, but they recommended a different approach. Remove the bombardier position entirely and replace it with a solid nose containing 4 .50 caliber guns, not 8. The company could produce a factory modification kit that would maintain proper engineering standards and weight distribution. Kenny rejected that recommendation. 4 guns weren't enough. Gunn's 8-gun design had already proven itself in tests. And they didn't have time to wait for factory kits to be produced in California and shipped across the Pacific. The war was happening now. Japanese convoys were moving now. Marines were dying on Guadalcanal now because supplies weren't getting through. He authorized field modifications using Gunn's design. Every 5th Air Force maintenance depot would receive technical drawings and instructions. Any damaged B-25 that came through for repair would be converted. Any new B-25 arriving in theater would be modified before entering service. By December 1942, the 5th Air Force had 12 gunships operational. They needed a combat test to prove the concept worked under fire against actual Japanese targets.
March 2, 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese intelligence had reported that an entire convoy was moving from Rabaul to Leh, carrying 7,000 troops and critical supplies. 8 destroyers escorting 8 transport ships. If that convoy reached Leh, it would reinforce Japanese positions in New Guinea and prolong the campaign by months. General Kenny committed everything the 5th Air Force had: B-17s for high-altitude bombing, Australian Beaufighters for reconnaissance, and 12 modified B-25 gunships led by Major Gunn himself. The attack began on March 3rd. B-17s hit the convoy first with bombs from 20,000 feet. They sank 1 transport, damaged others, but the convoy kept moving. That afternoon, the B-25 gunships went in. Gunn led the first wave, 6 Mitchell bombers in formation, flying 50 feet above the water at 250 miles per hour. Japanese destroyers opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun they had. Tracers filled the air. 25mm shells burst around the bombers. Zero fighters dove from above trying to intercept. Gunn lined up on a transport ship. Range closing fast. 1,000 yards, 800 yards, 500 yards. A Zero came in from the right, trying a head-on attack. The Zero pilot expected the bomber to be defenseless from the front. He was wrong. Gunn pressed the firing button. 8 .50 calibers opened fire. The cone of bullets caught the Zero head-on. Rounds punched through the engine, cockpit, and wings. The fighter exploded and tumbled into the water. Gunn held his course toward the transport. 300 yards, 200 yards. He fired again. The forward guns raked the ship's bridge and superstructure. Men on deck scattered. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent as their crews died. At 100 yards, Gunn released his bombs. The B-25 pulled up hard. The bombs skipped across the water like stones, hit the transport's hull below the waterline, and detonated. The explosion tore open the ship's side. Water poured in. The transport listed and began to sink. Gunn banked away and reformed with the other gunships. They made repeated runs throughout the afternoon. Every ship in the convoy was attacked. B-25 gunships strafed bridges and decks, then dropped bombs at masthead level. Australian Beaufighters hit them with torpedoes. American PT boats came in after dark. By March 5th, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. All 8 transport ships sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Of the 7,000 Japanese troops, fewer than 3,000 made it to shore. Most drowned when their ships went down. The 5th Air Force lost 4 aircraft total. None of the B-25 gunships were lost. The forward-firing guns had changed everything. Japanese fighters couldn't attack from ahead anymore. The bombers could defend themselves and attack surface targets simultaneously. Ships couldn't concentrate anti-aircraft fire when their gun crews were being shredded by .50 caliber rounds before the bombers even got close enough to drop bombs. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific, sent a personal commendation to Kenny and recommended that all B-25s in the Pacific be modified with forward-firing guns. The Army Air Forces approved it as official doctrine in April 1943. North American Aviation designed a factory kit that would be installed on new production B-25G and B-25H models. But the factory version had fewer guns and less firepower than Gunn's original 8-gun design. So 5th Air Force units kept building their own gunships, using Gunn's original 8-gun design.
Paul "Pappy" Gunn became a legend in the 5th Air Force. He continued modifying aircraft throughout the war. He added guns to A-20 Havocs. He turned B-24 Liberators into low-level strafers. He installed rocket rails on P-38 Lightnings before the factory developed official mounting systems. Every modification violated regulations. Every modification worked. Every modification saved American lives. By 1944, Gunn had been promoted to colonel. He commanded a composite squadron that flew everything from fighters to transports. He participated in some of the most important air campaigns in the Pacific: Philippines Liberation, Borneo, Okinawa. He flew over 400 combat missions. He shot down several Japanese aircraft while flying bombers. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross with oak leaf clusters, and the Air Medal with 11 oak leaf clusters. When the war ended in 1945, Gunn returned to the Philippines, where his family had been trapped during the Japanese occupation. His wife Polly and their 4 children had survived 3 years in Japanese prison camps. They were liberated by American forces in February 1945. Gunn retired from the Air Force in 1948 as a full colonel. He worked in civilian aviation and business until his death in 1957. He was 59 years old. The B-25 strafer concept he pioneered became doctrine across the U.S. military. The Marine Corps used it. The Navy used it. Post-war conflicts saw the same tactics applied to jet aircraft. The AC-130 gunship used in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan is a direct descendant of Gunn's improvised weapons. The principle is identical. Take a cargo or transport aircraft, add heavy guns pointing out the sides or forward, use it as a flying artillery platform to support ground troops or attack surface targets. North American Aviation eventually produced 405 factory-built B-25G and B-25H strafer models with 75mm cannons or multiple .50 caliber guns in the nose. But those factory versions came too late for the early Pacific campaigns, where Gunn's field modifications had already proven the concept. The mechanics who worked with Gunn received no official recognition. Angstad and the other sheet metal workers never got medals. The Australian tradesmen who helped build the first gunship weren't mentioned in official reports. They were just mechanics doing their jobs, solving problems, keeping aircraft flying. But the pilots who flew those gunships knew exactly who had saved their lives. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who turned bombers into gunships. Real ingenuity, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn and the thousands of airmen who fought in the Pacific don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.